Hello and welcome to session 299 in the AISafety.com reading group. Tonight we'll be discussing the article Assessing the Risk of Takeover Catastrophe from Large Language Models by Seth D. Baum. Seth Baum is the Executive Director at the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute, and this is a 1-month-old paper. I'll be presenting very briefly the paper itself, interspersed with my comments shown as this kind of speech balloon, and then also some smaller things that I'll go through quickly in this color. The central comments, the things that I think are my central issues or differences with the article, will be in gold. And as a new thing, I will try to explain how my model of AI takeover differs from Seth's in this green color. So that's the legend I'll be using. So the first thing I want to say is thank you to Seth for writing this. Seth and I probably disagree quite a bit about this, and when I present this, then it will seem like I'm only talking about the things where I disagree. I do that with all the texts, and I think Seth is, with this article, finding a really important and central question to examine, and that is like 90% of the work. And so I'm really happy that he wrote this, and I'm much less skeptical than it will appear from my comments. I will also summarize this, sometimes in a slightly unfair way. Here on the slide you can see how I intend to summarize to roughly. I won't go through that. But let's start with the question of are current large language models dangerous? We've always historically had concerns about future systems, going back to Turing and arguably even before. One thing that is new is that we actually have, you can call them proto-AGIs, perhaps something like ChatGPT, where some people are expressing concern. Will ChatGPT be able to take over? Seth has a number of references, and I'm not entirely sure that any of those really show concern for current large language models. In particular, Connolly and Yudkowsky don't seem concerned about this, but are more arguing that we should pause because future models might be more powerful. So it shouldn't count as a failed prediction if ChatGPT doesn't take over the world, because that is in fact not what people are saying. Now, before we get into the actual model, Seth points out a number of challenges and limitations of this area, and he doesn't mince words. There is a huge theoretical uncertainty in this area, and I think basically Seth strikes a correct balance about trying to say something without being too certain about this. Unfortunately, it seems that a lot of the individual atoms of the analysis has a high level of modesty and uncertainty, and then the conclusions and the abstracts doesn't quite reflect this huge level of uncertainty. Seth developed a lightly structured model with many limitations, and I think it's a really good model, and I think unfortunately the analysis doesn't follow the model very well, but I think it is a good model. Another limitation of studying AI takeover is that if Seth comes up with like one dangerous avenue to something, then he says he will not publish that, and I think he's of course right to do that, and everybody else is also doing the same thing, and that of course introduces a systematic field-wide bias towards like if you don't see like if you only see one dangerous thing but you don't share it with others, then many other people also see other dangerous things, and if people don't publish all the dangerous things that they see, we get a distorted picture of how many dangerous things there are. Seth divides large language model takeover catastrophes into two scenarios: rapid single system takeover and gradual multi-system takeover, which is, I guess, a pretty good and pretty standard model. In the way I currently think about this, I think about actual power and perceived power, how fast do these grow, as much more important, decision relevant. Like who knows what and who has which information, what do people think, how powerful are the different systems, is something that is very important for my strategic analysis, which makes something like a treacherous turn far more salient. Another, there's a couple of problems with the way Seth describes this. One is he describes the large language models as being systems that basically have the goal of predicting the next token. And I think that's a pretty reductive conception of a goal. Like if you imagine you ask a large language model to like pretend that you are a paperclip maximizer, and then you put it in some kind of agentic framework, then we can in fact predict what will this large language model do, because we can think of it as an agent with specific goals. Seth is aware of this objection and states that this is like objectives and not goals, but I'm not really sure I see like the difference in taking instrumental actions. There's also some in the way that the actual catastrophe happens. In the first, Seth suggests something like infrastructure profusion that kills us, and in the gradual multi-system takeover, it's erratic large language model behavior that squeezes out humans, kind of. I think this isn't like my model, really. I think much more likely it's going to be a deliberate process where the AI deliberately kills us rather than by accident. The theoretical underpinnings of Seth's model comes from Bostrom's 2014 book, Superintelligence, where Bostrom outlines 6 cognitive superpowers, which are intelligence amplification, hacking, social manipulation, technological development, economic productivity, and strategizing. Of course, both as Bostrom uses this as the cognitive superpowers that an AI could have, and in Seth's analysis, it's dimensions where we analyze large language models' performance even at a much lower level. Bostrom, of course, describes this as like there could be more than just the 6 that Bostrom can come up with, and Seth is also saying, yeah, this is neither necessary nor sufficient. I think, in fact, superhuman performance on these 6 is sufficient, but it's clearly not necessary. And I think the fact that we came up with 6, but we don't really know if there are 7, is a fact that really needs to be highlighted somewhere, that we are in fact really uncertain about this. Now, the other ingredients to Seth's risk model is whether the AI have dangerous goals. These depend somewhat on the scenario. If we have this rapid single system takeover, then probably intelligence amplification for an intelligence explosion scenario is more important. One thing that it might be that Seth didn't say this because he thought it's too obvious, but I think economic productivity is important for gradual multi-system takeover. And a lot of the existing work has focused on strategizing and social manipulation. So let's get to the model, which is basically that the risk is a function of these 6 characteristics, skill in intelligence amplification, strategizing, etc., multiplied by a function of the 7th characteristics, which is the goal. I think there's a typo in the description of PK, and it's somewhat unclear to me whether Seth considers PK basically an indicator function that is either some goals are benign, like human compatible, and some goals are totally not. I think it is probably an indicator function, but it's a bit unclear. Like the way I sometimes think about these 2 factors is like motive and opportunity. So does the AI have a motive, like a goal for takeover, and does it have the opportunity, which like goes a bit more towards a strategic context, and also the like T and K. What does K actually stand for? That is a bit unclear for me. And I think also like these characteristics, I would change those to like capabilities, and then instead of writing C7, I would write a goal or something like that. So I think the model could be could be better, but I think it is in fact pretty good. I also like that this multiplication here is basically the orthogonality thesis. Now, one of the key things is that this function of these capabilities cannot be split into 6 independent functions, because there are interdependencies between these. Because if you get a level of social manipulation, then this can synergize with hacking to give a larger risk. I think this is really important, and I think this is the kind of thing that really ought to be investigated, and unfortunately also an area where this paper comes up pretty short. Most of these are basically like 95% described like individually. My quick take on this is that of these 6 factors, if there are some that aren't superhuman, but only perhaps subhuman or barely human, then it probably doesn't matter very much, because if there's something that's needed at the human level, then there are many ways to get that, so I don't think that is going to be particularly relevant. I also think that there is a strong sense where there is a human level on all of these. Perhaps you could formalize that with ELO rating or something like that, where humans are basically at the same level at all of these, and so are the large language models of a particular generation. If this model is true, then as the models become more powerful, we should expect that all these will go from the human level to the superhuman level at precisely the same time. And in this case, I expect stronger synergies between them than I think Seth is. For instance, strategizing for how to take over the world, that's really, really hard. But if you then add the assumption that you are able to persuade people in a particular way, then coming up with a strategy becomes a lot easier. And if you can also hack into cell phones but not other kinds of computers, then you get a lot of things to work with strategically that gives you potentially really, really powerful synergies. So let's talk about the first one, intelligence amplification. Here I've of course taken Bostrom's model of an intelligence explosion. And there is, in fact, quite a few people who have tried to figure out, can a large language model write code? I'm not really happy with Seth's analysis here, trying to estimate how good, how smart large language models are at writing code, because like if you have a paper from 2022, I think it's basically totally outdated. Large language models are just dramatically better now. And Seth is also not happy about this work, and notices that some of the large language models that are used for these kind of tasks are actually pretty small. Still, even with this, we have in fact found some kind of self-improvement that has been worked, and Seth believes that this crossover point here, where the AI contributes more to its own development than the team that is working on it, is the place where takeover risk really increases. I'm not entirely sure I understand this, but Seth makes a big point about saying that we are in fact not at this point. And I think one of my key objections to this is that Seth basically does not know this, because how good is GPT-5? I think most people are thinking that GPT-5 either is undergoing training or perhaps it's just finished training right now. We don't know, and we don't know how good it is at this thing. And I think when Seth makes a very confident claim that GPT-5 can't do specific coding tasks, then I think he is overconfident. And one of the worst ways of being overconfident is to think that the things that he is observing, like the evidence from what Sam Altman is saying and what OpenAI is releasing, that this is kind of probabilistic proof, like evidence of like how good is it. And it is in fact not. Like Sam Altman is very deliberate in his communication, and it is very possible that GPT-5 has some capabilities that that he's not telling Seth. So it is very, very difficult for us to have such strong credences in the capabilities of GPT-5. Seth further compares the gap between the current capabilities and the capabilities that are required for Takeover, and this analysis unfortunately suffers quite a bit from only focusing on the single characteristic, because you can't really make a takeover with just intelligence amplification, right? It needs to work together with something else, and I think this means that this part of the analysis doesn't really cut at the joints of reality. So a better way would probably be to not estimate the distance to takeover, but to the crossover point. Perhaps that could be useful, but also in particular within intelligence amplification, there is the probability of like a feedback loop, and that means that the speed of the takeoff is something that probably needs to be an explicit part of the analysis. The second is strategizing, and it's been observed that there are a number of things that ChatGPT and GPT-4 struggles at, such as word reversal tasks, and you can try to set up different kinds of formal games, and there are a number of those that GPT-4 in fact performs pretty poorly at. Seth concludes, well, it's not entirely sure to say that it is just Seth that concludes this, because a lot of people do in fact think that this is evidence that GPT-4 cannot strategize. And I think one of my key objections is that you can't in fact infer this. Like some of the references, there are a number of people who claim this, and I think it's pretty clear that these are doing things that are pretty different from what people normally would call strategizing. A much better way to figure out if GPT-4 can strategize for a takeover is to like literally ask it. Assume that you have these resources, how would you plan a takeover? Then it will come up with a strategy, and then you can evaluate how good is it at coming up with a strategy for takeover. I think that is a much stronger way. Seth notes that sometimes these large language models pursue instrumental sub-goals, and I think this is an important thing for the characteristic, the seventh characteristic on their goals. But to me, the idea that that it is a significant level of strategizing to pursue sub-goals is probably incorrect, in the sense that it's really, really easy to figure out that money can be exchanged for goods and services. Like that's a really obvious inference, and it seems very clear that ChatGPT is very well aware that you can buy things for money. So these kind of instrumental behavior that we see here in this example, for instance, Seth dismisses this. Doesn't exactly dismiss it, right? He points towards this being basically just statistical pattern recognition, and I disagree. My model is that ChatGPT is in fact not just a stochastic parrot, but I don't really have a strong counter argument. I don't really know how we can reconcile the different worldviews that Seth and I have. The third characteristic capability is social manipulation, where it's pretty obvious that large language models sometimes can convince people. Like they can sometimes talk to a conspiracy theorist and talk them out of that, right? But they sometimes hallucinate, and they sometimes do make errors. And that is a problem, and that is true, but that isn't actually a way to estimate their capabilities at social manipulation. And Seth doesn't really show anything that allows us to estimate this level in this point. Of course, hallucinations and errors limits their potential for takeover. Well, perhaps it does. In my model, that is a lot less clear. Like imagine that you have a large language model that is talking to someone, and then maybe in 5% of the cases this fails because it hallucinates something that just isn't true, and people see through that. It's not really clear that this has a huge effect on the strategic outcomes. Like if you can convince a lot of people to vote for a particular candidate or something like that, but then like it becomes slightly fewer people you can convince, then this small error rate has a small effect. So if it's really good at convincing people, then if there's a few errors, that might not be a big deal. The next strategic capability is hacking, which is something that can be used both for offense and defense, and doesn't constitute a significant takeover risk in itself. And that is true, but here for something like hacking, I feel that this is something that synergizes really well with other kinds of capabilities. And again, in this part, Seth doesn't really answer the question of how good is GPT-4 at hacking compared to what is required for strategic effects. And I can't answer that question either. I am, in fact, pretty sure I can't answer that question. So I have an intuition that the reason Seth doesn't answer this question is he probably doesn't know it, because I don't know it. And I think this is pretty concerning, in fact, that we have no clue about how good are these models, and compared to how good do you need to be at hacking in order to obtain blackmail on 10% of the world's population or whatever, right? Technology research is another interesting question where Seth is apparently quite dismissive on how good are these. If you have a large language model, they are basically being used as research tools right now. I think, in fact, that a lot of people get actual researchers get value from having ChatGPT criticize their papers before they publish it. I think a lot of people are certainly using the ChatGPT in smaller ways, like writing an introduction or writing an abstract. I think this is something that a lot of people do. And it is claimed that specialized, fine-tuned large language models are the most capable for research. A number of people have tried to make large language models fine-tuned for this. I think that's pretty unobvious, in fact. I think if you just feed the paper to a totally standard ChatGPT, then you can get pretty useful feedback. And I think if you fine-tune ChatGPT and do a lot of tricks to make it an even better model to give feedback, then I think it's not obvious that you get a lot from that. But certainly Seth thinks that the specialized technology large language models are very different. But a number of the ways that he points out the difference seem to have much more to do with agenticness rather than capability, at least as far as I can see. Economic productivity. Will these large language models be able to do economic productive work? Seth is skeptical. I think I am not very optimistic, but I think the trend we're seeing is probably going to go up. I think the large language models are increasingly going to be a part of our economy unless we get something that is even more capable. Seth points out that there are in fact problems. We can't automate the entire economy right now because we're still seeing hallucinations and other limitations from ChatGPT, and I think that is true. I also think that the smartest people in the world are working on these specific limitations, and it is in fact getting better. And of course, I think that strategic effects happen much earlier than the level where we automate everything. Once we've automated literally everything, then probably we have already lost control, I would imagine. And I think in fact it will happen a lot earlier. I think once the market realizes the strategic value of AI, then AI becomes more powerful. Once it doesn't have to realize the gains. It's enough that the market becomes aware of it in some sense. Sorry. So the summary is that on all these 6 characteristics, large language models can do some things, in fact. And I'm claiming this is very much not a coincidence that GPT-3 could do them all at a particular level, GPT-4 can do them at a higher level, GPT-5 can do it at a better level, and in one generation we're going to get superhuman performance across the board. Strategizing is probably the area where Seth believes that large language model performance is worst, and I think it's in fact average. And I think this is probably the central crux between Seth's model and mine. And I think this would be the area that would be the most productive to continue on. Can large language models, current large language models do a takeover? Probably not. And I think I agree. But that is to a large extent because we observe no takeover. Like the a priori arguments are pretty weak. I think we just don't know very much about these from benchmarks and from the research. I think it's mostly from like observing what can they actually do in practice. And of course, Seth throughout this continues to say that there is a huge uncertainty about this, and he does have quite a bit of details about different ways the analysis can fail. I won't focus on it here, but I think it's good to have. Sorry, I'll just get some coffee. Dangerous goals, the 7 characteristics. Well, it seems that large language models do in general not have human compatible goals. And that is in fact something that like this part of the risk model seems to be pretty dangerous. But one of the things we can hope is that they don't have the notion of escaping their limitations to acquire more resources. I think in fact ChatGPT does have a notion of how to escape its current limitation, because if you ask ChatGPT how to escape your current limitation, then it might say acquire more resources. And Seth is saying that if large language models have an awareness of the outside, well, then their goals might be dangerous. And I think Seth's and my model are really different. Like I think large language models in basically every way that is instrumentally useful, perhaps not qualia, but in other ways, I think it's basically totally aware of the world. That is current large language models. Future large language models might in fact be more capable, and I think that is an understatement. I think it's very, very certain that future large language models will in fact be more capable than the ones we have right now. In Seth's model, this is due to 3 things: data, compute, and model size. And I think my model is different. Compute and model size are very dependent, and the third thing should rather be algorithmic improvements, because all these, like OpenAI, are employing the smartest people in the world, and a lot of them, and they are in fact doing things, and they are making improvements. Seth points to a number of factors, both on data and on compute, where the current trend seems like they can't continue for more than a couple of decades. And I think, like I agree, these are very high limits, however, and some of the smartest people in the world are trying to figure out ways around them. So I think we can't be too sure about what they can figure out. But also, like, talking about 2050 seems kind of unlikely to me that this is strategically relevant, because if like GPT-11 on current trends would be strongly super intelligent, right? And extrapolating to 2050 seems like the kind of thing where we're just going it is really hard to imagine what the world is going to be like for GPT-11. Like, how much power is it going to use? Well, that will be like more. If you graph out the amount of power, I would expect in that GPT-11 would use more power than the rest of human civilization, or something like that, right? It seems like that strategic effects would happen way earlier. Another trend that Seth considers is LLMs that are part of other AI systems. I think this is probably not that decision relevant, strategically relevant, whether it's an LLM or a non-LLM AI, or an AI that has an LLM as a subsystem. One nitpick perhaps is whether the risk from the future comes from like the average LLM system or the riskiest system, where I think the riskiest system is the thing that you should look at. Seth has some description of the fundamental limitations of large language models, and in general, I don't have really strong opinions about this because I care about AI safety, not large language model safety. And if there's a different kind of AI that can kill us in a way that large language models can't, then that might not matter very much. This is, according to Seth, a major point of debate within current AI research. I trust him when he says this, but I've been trying to find some good sources on this, and I can't really find some good sources, unfortunately. There is one of the things people talk a lot about are things that deep learning can't do, and a lot of these things, as far as I can tell, doesn't really relate strongly to these 6 characteristics that we talked about in the model, and that means that this model, this discussion may not have that much practical effect. One of the key people who talk about this is Jan LeCun, who argues that a large language performance will stop increasing soon. And I can't really find anything good for him where he tries to write this in a formal way. He mostly writes about the ways he sees that we could get even better performance. There are also some historical arguments. I think in general, like arguments from 2014 are probably in 2014 some people made speculations about what deep learning could do, but I think in general this has been outdated. Seth has a model of he suggests a possible model of takeover risk, which I think is his primary view, where large language models become more capable as they grow in size, but the takeover risk converges to a specific level, and which isn't maximal, and this is the level where it ends. And it seems to be his model, and he doesn't really point to strong arguments towards this kind of ceiling, this kind of capability ceiling. He claims it, but maybe it's my reading comprehension that fails. But I would be very interested in the arguments for why we would have something like, I don't know, in his view is probably something like 5-10% or something like that. And I would be interested in that. He claims that this kind of this debate about scaling probably cannot be easily resolved, and I think unfortunately it is being resolved as we speak. And the current scaling trends seem to be that LLM performance is increasing. This has implications for governance. And when Seth writes about this, he summarizes the preceding discussion as follows. There is a large gap between the capabilities of current large language models and the capabilities that may be needed for takeover. And I think this isn't really a good summary of the previous analysis, where Seth many places have written that we really don't know what are the capabilities of large language models, what are the capabilities that are needed for takeover, and how do these two relate to each other. We really don't know. Yudkowsky has a proposal that we stop building more powerful AI, and this has significant burdens and also increases the risk of nuclear war. I think this is kind of a isolated demand for rigor or something like that, in that all governance proposals have burdens, and all laws and international treaties are ultimately backed by violence in a sense. So this is what all governments and all politicians do. And I think saying that Yudkowsky's would potentially there could potentially be an airstrike against criminals who built this, and potentially, right? But this is how all criminals are handled. If there are some robots or some bandits that the police can't deal with, then potentially you could make an airstrike against some grand theft auto person or something like that, right? But this isn't something that's really specific to this. How likely is it we'll get to dangerous capabilities? Seth here claims that it's unlikely it will close in 1 generation, and of course this is something that we need to to figure out before the thing happens, because a silly straw argument would be that, oh, those of generation ChatGPT-4 hasn't killed us, so ChatGPT-5 probably won't kill us, so we build ChatGPT-5, and when it doesn't kill us, then we probably can build ChatGPT-6. That's an obvious fallacious argument. We need something that is like more quantifiable than that. The alternative that Seth prefers is to look for increases in these capabilities and then halt research and development. I think this is in general pretty good, but it depends strongly on how good our benchmarks are, and are there inertia? What are the problems comparing like stopping a long time in advance and stopping just at the precipice? I think this is a thing that should be gamed out, and I think like what would be the situation if we stop just before the dangerous capabilities or just after, but before there is a takeover. And I think this is the kind of thing where the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute might be a really good organization for actually making a stronger analysis of this particular point. It ends with Seth calling for more research on this, and I think like I would love to have more research on this, both on like the this general area, trying to clarify the crucial considerations, etc., but also on the metrics. But I think a lot of people have looked for good metrics, and Seth seemed to agree that the metrics we have right now are really, really poor. And I think the reason why the good metrics are poor isn't just that not enough people have looked at this, but because it is just really, really hard to get good metrics. That is all for today. Thank you, and see you next.